Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio Chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your Webcast moderator. Today is Friday, November 5th, and we will hear the presentation, The Impact of COVID-19 on School Districts. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box or in the questions box there on your GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in that questions box, and we'll hopefully get to those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. Coming up on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all of those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we are sponsored by the Pennsylvania chapter of APA. So thanks to you all for joining us this year and for bringing this great session to us. Coming up next on your screen is a list of some of our upcoming webcasts. I think this is it. No, there might be one more. I think there's one more. This is it for the rest of the year, plus one more, I think maybe somewhere in the beginning of December. So you can register for these webcasts on our webcast website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, and make sure you check back often because, in fact, we're scheduling for 2022 sessions already. January and February are already all booked up, so be sure to check back often. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can record those credits by heading over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any timely information like date or time changes. I also post when there are new sessions available for you to register for. And I send out weekly reminders on Facebook as well for our upcoming session on Friday. And subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's where we post all of our recordings. We record all of our sessions, post them there. We have, probably 400 or so sessions at this point. So join us, subscribe to us, and you'll get notified when a new session is posted up onto our YouTube channel. So that's it for my housekeeping items. Again, if you have any questions for today's panelists, just type those in that questions box and we'll get to them. Don't raise your hand because we don't use that function. We just use the chat function. So be sure to type those in. Well, that's it. I'm going to turn it over now to Peter, who is going to kick things off. I'm going to stop showing my screen for a second here. And Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Christine. My name is Peter Wolforst. I'm a member of the Pennsylvania chapter of the American Planning Association. My day job is Penn State Extension Community Development Educator. Before that, though, I was a county planning director. So there is no question that COVID has had a big impact on schools across this country. We saw it in the spring of 2020. When all the schools were shut down, it extended into the 2021 academic year where some schools were virtual, some were hybrid, and some were face-to-face. And it continues to the 2021-2022 academic year where most schools in this country are probably in person, but there might be some that are having some hybrids. And this really has affected student achievement over the last couple of years with this pandemic affecting how kids are learning. So today's webinar, we have three panelists that are going to talk about the intersection of what's happened with our schools in the communities that they're housed in. And so they're going to talk about some of the things that have really impacted schools, such as broadband access. We've all known about the online learning implications for more flexible and customizable instruction models. We've seen different models over the last couple of years. What is the role of schools and the facilities as a community resource hub, or what is their role in communities? So I'm going to introduce each of the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to them for their presentation. So our first panelist is Dr. Mark Deracco. Since January 2017, Mark has served as Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators. He was a public school educator for 38 years in 4 different school districts, including 33 years as an administrator in a school district. He held a number of administrative positions in the Lewisburg area school district over a 22-year period, including the middle school principal, secondary principal, assistant superintendent, as well as superintendent for the final 14 years. He has a BS in elementary ed at Mansfield University, MS in educational administration from Bucknell University, and a PhD from Penn State. He was selected by his peers as a 2016 Pennsylvania Superintendent of the Year, receiving recognition at both the state and national level. Our second presenter is John Mclaughlin. John is a founder and chair of Galileo Education, Inc., a startup providing on-site and remote schooling, and the managing partner of Mclaughlin Advisors, an advisory for owners of and investors in clinics which provide applied behavior analysis for children with autism. Starting in the early 1990s, he has devoted his professional career to examining market forces, charter schools, open enrollment, dual enrollment, contracted special education within public education. He has received his BA, MA, and PhD from Peabody College of Vanderbilt, University of Chicago, and the University of Minnesota. Our third presenter is Chelsea Waite. She's a senior researcher at the Center on Reinventing Public Education. Along with partners at dozens of other collaborating organizations, she leads the Canopy Project to build better collective knowledge on K-12 innovation from a diverse set of schools around the country. Before she joined the center, she worked at the Christensen Institute, where she served as an education research fellow studying school design, student agency, and models for peer-to-peer support in K-12. She built partnerships and designed learning programs at Digital Promise and taught English as a post-secondary level in the northeast of Brazil. She holds a BA in history from Brown University and an MS in social innovation from Cambridge University. So at this point, I'm going to mute myself and turn off my camera and turn it over to Mark.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all see my screen all right. It's a pleasure. Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you for that introduction. Very much appreciated. I'm going to take a few moments and walk you through some information that we have been monitoring here at the Pennsylvania Association of School Administrators. Our association has about 900 members, mostly school superintendents, assistant superintendents, school leaders, either in building level or at the central office level. And we monitor various concerns in regard to public education across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And what I'm going to do is share some of the information we've been monitoring and following, and talk about the impact that COVID-19 has had on Pennsylvania school districts. So the first slide I'm going to show you is a spreadsheet with data regarding enrollment in Pennsylvania. So if you look at this spreadsheet, on the far left column, you see at the upper top in the green bars, the 2019-2020 school year. So of course, this was the pre-pandemic enrollments across Pennsylvania during that school year. The top line shows public school enrollment. Now in Pennsylvania, we have public charter schools, both cyber charter schools and brick and mortar charter schools, as well as traditional public schools. So the enrollment for all three of those entities are in that top line. Then the line where you see PNPE, those are private and non-public education schools. So this would include your parochial schools as well as all your private schools. So as you can see, the totals going across in the 2019-2020 school year, we had approximately 1.7 million students in some form of public education and about 207,000 students in private and parochial schools. for a grand total of about 1.9 million students. Then the pandemic hit. And if we look at the tan bars, we can see that public school enrollment dropped significantly down to 1.687 million students, and private and parochial schools dropped down to 198,000. So we lost about 35,000 students to enrollment during the pandemic year of 2021. And part of the concern is trying to figure out what happened to those students. Where did they go? And we have been able to locate some of them, but certainly not the majority of them. So what traditionally happens in school districts is when a family leaves one district and they move to another community, whether it's in state or out of state, that next district they enroll in seeks out the previous school to ask for those records. Well, we've had a lot of families that have moved or are not responding to the local district, and no other district has claimed them. So that's a concern for us. I know this is happening across the United States as well. But what's interesting to see here in the tan bars is where most of the student population dropped. So you can see a precipitous drop in kindergarten. And we believe that many parents just didn't send their kids to kindergarten, understanding that it may be online during the 2021 year, and they didn't want to start their children in an online format. But the other interesting part of this data, if you look to the far right of the tan blocks, is that the high school enrollments stayed pretty strong. They stayed pretty stable, especially 11th and 12th graders. We actually saw some increase in population there. So that was an interesting development with the pandemic data. When we look at the blue bars at the bottom, we don't have the actual enrollment numbers for this year yet. Our Department of Education uploads those sometime in October and makes them public sometime in November. Unfortunately, I don't have those yet for you, but they always give a set of projections. And as you can see here, our Department of Education is projecting that enrollment is going to bounce back up somewhat this year. You can see a significant increase in kindergarten enrollment and first grade enrollment. But once again, we're seeing some loss of enrollment in those elementary years, but significant gains back in the middle school and high school years. So there are some implications here. It could be the cause of changes in the home environment and the home workforce, where many parents may now be working at home permanently. They may have liked the idea of their kids being at home with them and doing online learning at home. So maybe in those younger years, more parents want to keep their kids at home and stay with some form of online learning. We did see in Pennsylvania a gain of 22,000 students going from traditional public schools to cyber schools. And we're waiting to see how many of those students stayed with those cyber schools this year and how many came back to their traditional schools. So it looks like for the most part, the enrollment trends may be changing a little bit at our elementary levels, but stabilizing or even growing at our secondary levels back to in-person learning. A couple of comments on the long-term academic and social and emotional impact of the pandemic. We know that learning loss did occur. And part of the reason for the learning loss is when schools went to remote learning. We do know that remote learning is not as effective as in-person learning. There are many important and positive aspects of online learning and using technology for learning. But when you take away the in-person component of learning, students typically don't do as well, according to the research and according to most of the data. You add on top of that many districts were caught short or caught by surprise with having to go fully remote. They weren't prepared for that. So not only do we know that online learning typically isn't as effective as in-person learning, but when school districts really weren't ready to start to use that method of instruction, it added extra problems and concerns and issues to the learning process. So we know there's some significant learning gaps that have occurred dating back to March 2020. And depending if the district was fully remote all of last year or just partially remote all of last year, there is some learning loss. And this has exacerbated budgets in Pennsylvania because as the learning loss situation is now more prominent as we get our kids back to in-person learning this year, we have noticed that districts are needing additional services. They need not only more teachers and more support staff help to assist teachers, but they're also finding that the mental health issues that our students had prior to the pandemic have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so we have many districts wanting to hire more counselors and social workers and school psychologists, which is putting an extraordinary strain on school district budgets. And unfortunately, our state legislature is not supporting school districts to the level which we think they should. So consequently, local school districts have to deal with those annual typical difficult budget issues of, do we raise property taxes, or do we reduce programming or reduce personnel, or some combination of all three? I wanted to share with you just for a moment the impact of the federal stimulus funds, at least coming into Pennsylvania. So there have been 3 different stimulus bills that were passed in the United States Congress that have funneled money to Pennsylvania. The very first one is what we call the ESSER 1 allocation, and that sent about $500,000 to Pennsylvania schools. ESSER 2 came out, and that sent over $2 billion to Pennsylvania schools. And then the final allocation came out through the American Rescue Act, and that sent about $4.5 billion to Pennsylvania public schools. In addition, our special ed allocation was increased by about $3 billion, and our private and parochial schools received an increase of about $2.7 billion. In all, public education in Pennsylvania received about $13.7 billion in additional funding from the federal government, and our state government received about $7.3 billion. So this is a lot of money. This money, though, is for one-time use only. This money should not be used for ongoing expenses like hiring teachers and support staff and specialized staff such as counselors and social workers and so forth, because of course we all know that within 3 years all this money goes away. It's one-time expenditure money only. So consequently, schools in Pennsylvania, as I'm sure around the rest of the country, are dealing with this dilemma where they have more money in their district budgets than they could have ever imagined, but they only can use it for specific things, understanding that that money isn't always going to be there. So districts are struggling right now as to how to allocate that money, what's the best way to use it. And to exacerbate the issue in Pennsylvania, school districts had to put out tremendous amounts of money to get through the pandemic. So if we take a look at the 2021 year, which was the pandemic year, because so many more kids decided to go to the cyber charter schools, and in Pennsylvania, school districts must pay the tuition for students to go to cyber charter schools. That cost alone in that 1 year increased $350 million in Pennsylvania. And to cover all the other mandated costs in PA, whether it's special ed or we have a pension crisis here that has to be paid for, among other things, that it was expected to increase another $665 million. So over a 2-year period, our school districts were about $1.15 billion in the hole through these mandated costs. And therefore, one of the things they have to sort of wrestle with is, do we use any of the federal money to help us offset those costs? understanding that we're going to have to pay to fill that gap somewhere down the road. So these federal dollars are one-time infusion dollars. They're not meant to be with districts for a long period of time. So it's creating a lot of difficult decisions in our schools how to best use these funds to mitigate the consequences of the pandemic. So while we don't think these funds are going to be enough to overcome the long-term needs of our students, everything from academic loss to mental health needs that they have, we do believe that these dollars can be used for some of the learning environment upgrades that need to be done, mostly HVAC and building upgrades to improve and enhance the in-school learning environment. So every year, our association, along with our Business Officials Association, we do semi-annual surveys. And in our spring 2021 survey done earlier this year, we asked our school district superintendents and business officials, what are you going to do with your federal stimulus dollars? What are the top things you're going to spend that money on? And these were the top 6. First is purchasing technology for students in the regular classroom, because when the pandemic hit, there were many districts that didn't have a computer for every student or a tablet for every student. There were many districts who could not make sure that all their kids had internet access. The next is addressing learning loss. A lot of districts set up summer programs this past summer. They're doing after-school programs, enhanced remediation programs in school this year. They're spending quite a bit of money on that. And the next is planning for next summer. To once again do summer activities for learning loss for their kids. And then as you see, number 4, I mentioned earlier, providing technology and internet access. That is a huge issue in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is a much more rural state than most people realize and understand. And we still have vast geographical sections of our Commonwealth where kids and even staff members and adults don't have access to internet. Mental health services and support was number 5. And the final one, which I found interesting, but this really has created a bit of a boom here, a building boom in Pennsylvania, is about 2/3 of the school districts have said they're going to use some of their federal money to either repair or improve their facilities, their HVAC systems. Many of these districts are adding on to their classrooms because during the pandemic, one of the things they wanted to do to try to get kids back in the building was space them out. In Pennsylvania, we required 6 feet of social distancing between students, and many school districts couldn't do that because they didn't have the physical space. So some districts are actually adding more physical space to their buildings and putting on additional classrooms and so forth. So that's how the pandemic is affecting Pennsylvania school districts from our perspective at PASA. And with that, now I'm going to turn this over to our next presenter, who is John. So John, here you go.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. Let me share my screen here. Should I hit the right button? Can you see my screen, folks? Let's see.
Now I can, John.
Thank you very much.
Just need to put it in a slideshow mode.
Let me do that. I got to move myself down from, here we go. And I don't know where I went, but I believe that, can you see me there, Peter?
I can see the slides.
Okay, there I am somewhere. At least I can see myself, I thought. Well, thank you very much for allowing me to visit with the Planners Association. I appreciate being here. Let me close that off. And appreciate what Mark has said from the Pennsylvania perspective. And I'd like to share some of my thoughts on how COVID has impacted school districts across the country. I live in South Dakota, and I work with school districts and educational businesses, particularly in the special ed area across the country. So it's been very interesting to see differences in the last 20 months as we've gone through COVID. Here, one of the things I think is, excuse me, I'm trying to advance my slide, Christine. There we go. One of the things that Mark said is that remote learning, in much research has said it has not been as effective as classroom learning. Lots of research is out on remote learning, and as Mark said, and as the research even says, that remote learning was somewhat thrust upon an underprepared public school system when COVID hit in March of 2020. And the scramble to impact or to put in place remote learning was heroic, but the results weren't great. Nonetheless, I feel that remote learning is going to be here to stay. There have been some kind of state responses or reactions, sometimes I think more politically driven than pedagogically driven, to limit or outlaw remote learning to take place in states. I think that's a knee-jerk reaction. The price of traditional in-class learning is somewhere close to $14,000 on average per child in America. The cost of remote learning this year, or this past academic year, was closer to about $5,200. And you see the arrows in my little diagram here. Traditional education cost will continue to rise. Remote education's cost will continue to go down as technology improves and it is expanded just by volume. So I think remote learning is here to stay. Even those who have kind of forbid it as of late, I think will be coming back to it in the fairly near future. It's the technologies that support remote learning are just going to ever increase. It's not going to take the humanity out of teaching. It's not going to be a school in a box. It's not going to be a bloodless type of education delivery. It's going to evolve rapidly in the coming years, as perhaps some of my other slides support that notion that it will remove more kids. Mark had mentioned the number of kids in Pennsylvania's cyber charter school, and Pennsylvania has a very robust cyber charter school compared to most states. And I think that we'll just see more of that. That's one of my first premises. And I think about this in terms of my audience here. You are planners across the country, and schools are vital components of communities. And as they evolve with the politics, the technology, I guess the COVID impact of what it's doing to schools, I think it's going to affect the central role of public education facilities in the planning process. Part of the reason I think that it's going to continue to make it tough on traditional public schools is that choice and vouchers expand, are continuing to expand. Charter schools are public schools. They are publicly funded. They technically or supposedly had a fairly open enrollment policy, though that's debatable, but they are public schools, but they're different than your traditional public schools in terms of where they're located, what type of state support goes to their facilities. That varies quite a bit across the country. Charter schools started in 1991 in Minnesota. And I remember being interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, are charter schools going to be a business? That was probably about 1995 or 6, when they were beginning to get some legs under them in terms of volume. I said, no, I don't think so. I think that charter schools will face the same financial impacts that public schools, traditional public schools face, and that they're very labor intensive, with 75 to 80% of the resources, financial resources, going to teachers. And so I didn't think there would be a great business opportunity. I think I was wrong. Charter schools have grown to about, this says 74 this morning, and just kind of doing some fact checking on my own numbers, 7,500 seems to be the fall of 21 number, enrolling over 3.3 million to 3.5 million kids are in these schools. Now remember, they are public schools, but it's part of an expansion that we have in the nation to expand choice for parents. I put on this slide as well that there are 28 voucher programs across the country, state voucher programs that are now enrolling about not quite 250,000 children in who take a state voucher to go to a private school. A lot of those are around special needs kids, but they are still voucher programs that take the state money, put it in the parents' hands, and the parent goes shopping for the school. Likewise, there are 24 tax credit programs supporting around 300,000 kids around the country to go to schools that are not traditional public schools. And in our nation, we have about 100,000 kids, and that's probably a low estimate because it's a very hard number to get our arms around, of children with special education needs that attend private special schools at public district expense. These are just examples of the choice in vouchers that tend to get more and more, they're getting more and more momentum. Every legislative season, we see more tax benefits, voucher programs, education savings accounts debated and often passed inside of state legislatures where this action takes place that again erodes the attendance at traditional public schools. We didn't mention in that last chart about the homeschoolers, and one of the things that Mark said is Pennsylvania lost kids, as every state did during the pandemic. Where they went continues to be a mystery. It's hard to count homeschoolers in this country. It's hard for states to count them. Homeschoolers are not secretive people, but they're not organized in any way that necessarily allows you to do a nose count of the kids. Right now, there's somewhere between the number of kids who have homeschooled through the pandemic has more than doubled. When we were homeschooling pre-pandemic, we were about at 2.5 million kids by best estimate, or about 4% of children in American schooling, school-age children. That's jumped somewhere between 3.5% to 5%, which could take it up to 7 to 8% of children, school-age children being homeschooled. That's a lot. I have that it saves $65 billion for taxpayers. That money stays in the system. Those homeschool parents still pay their property taxes, but the kids are not in the school, and eventually that catches up with the school, who are paid by their formulas by the number of cheeks and seats or butts and seats for kids, and that will hurt public education as the kids who have gone into the homeschooling kind of catch up on not being on the rolls of public education. But I think homeschooling is going to mushroom. I think the pandemic has not only encouraged families to bring their kids home for their health and safety, as Mark showed again, younger children are more likely to be missing from school than high schoolers. But parents are beginning to change their tune, if you will. The other thing that the pandemic showed, again, for planning purposes and for kind of crystal balling what your communities will look like in coming years and decades, the pandemic showed that schooling, a lot of families tended to think that, gosh, my child can get through his schoolwork in 2 hours online. Why is he there at the building for 7 or 8 hours a day? So that put more wind in the sails of alternative educators, homeschoolers, the development of learning pods in neighborhoods or in apartment complexes that, again, are probably going to get more sanction, if you will, as public education, as we come together in a post-COVID society, and parents are demanding a lot more say and are quite angry right now at what's going on in public education. No matter where you live, where you're sitting as a listener of this webinar, you understand the tension in your own communities, in your own school board meetings, in your own neighborhoods about the issue of vaccines, masks, and whether kids need to have the shots, or parents and teachers need to have the shots, and whether they need to wear masks at school. It's a horribly divisive situation that we're in, but there'll be residue. I think is the residual information, or the residual effect is going to be a broadening of schooling choices for kids post-pandemic. And again, that affects the shape of public education and the shape of communities. One of the things that I've thought about a lot in years ago, somewhere in maybe the late 1990s, I met with the National School Boards Association and the Superintendents Association. I put on a meeting in Washington with the fact that we have over $300 billion of repairs needed to our 100,000 public school buildings. I think there are actually 110,000 individual public school buildings in the country right now. And it was just, there's just an enormous backlog. I noted a moment ago, I live in South Dakota, and one of the places here, we only have about 150,000 public school children in this small population, relatively large geographic state. But many of our rural public schools that are, like all parts of America, are being depopulated, and the school buildings are in horrible shape, just terrible shape. That's not unique to rural South Dakota. It's not unique to this state at all, but it's true across the country. What's going to happen, though, goes back to that first slide, in my view, that it's a lot cheaper to do children remotely or virtually than it is to continue to bring them in from a transportation standpoint. And is, again, distance learning improves its efficiency and effectiveness and its humanity. I think public school facilities are going to change. I'm kind of reading from bottom to top on my slide, but I think schools are going to become check-in stations rather than, I guess my pejorative term, holding tanks. It's not very polite, but kids aren't going to need to spend 7:30 to 3 o'clock in a building, or 8 o'clock to 3:30, whatever the local times are. I think school buildings are going to go the way of shopping malls, movie theaters, and office buildings. People are going to learn in smaller environments. They want this now. It's not just protection from the pandemic, but it's trying to create a scale of schooling and an interaction between teachers and children and parents and teachers that's really on a very personal scale. That the anonymity that many of our large public schools create is growing to be less and less acceptable. So I think as you plan and as you think, and my son is a planner, an urban planner, and he works in Omaha. And one of the things that he says, he strikes us as schools, Dad, often somebody donates 50 acres on the edge of town to build a new public school, and the planners in the city pull their hair out because he said, we weren't planning to get services out there for another 4 years or something, and they have to modify all that. And so it's been fun to talk to him and watch his career as a relatively young planner, and as it interacts with my life as a kind of a school guy and somewhat prognosticator, retired professor type guy. Anyway, we'll push on here. Here are a couple of megatrends. I think I've got 2 more slides here. There are 2 megatrends that I really think are very vital, not just for schooling, but for planners too. Birth rates in the United States are decreasing. We just this spring showed the 6th straight decline in the number of children born in this country. 2020 had the lowest birth rate since 1979. The thing that gets me is bullets 3 and 4, that we have less children being born than we are graduating seniors out of high school. So we're not replacing our kids. We're moving to a negative replacement rate. And this is a trend. This isn't one time year. This is a trend that concerns us as educators, as planners, and as a system that is going to serve less children rather than more, if we're looking at these figures here. The other part of this mega trend to me is a theme that I've been talking about in my minutes here: technology. Pre-pandemic, digital learning was expected not to reach $1 trillion industry until 2034. About a year into the pandemic, it is projected that digital learning will be $1 trillion industry by 2027. That's cutting the development, or at least the growth rate, by half in time to reach that $1 trillion number. What this is representative of is the enormous pressure that schools, public schools in particular, are under by a burgeoning and rapidly expanding technology industry around schooling. We see it in our own children's lives, in their schools. We see it in university deliveries. We see it even in what we're doing here today, the webinar continuing education opportunity that we're all participating in. That's an enormous pressure on public education. And that's part of the reason I, again, feel like remote learning is going to be far more acceptable and far more effective for children in coming years. My final slide, ladies and gentlemen, is what I just said, the percent of public school enrollment. And this is percent of public school traditional enrollment, not counting the fact that charter schools are public schools. They are very different, and they're a different delivery system, if you will. In 1999, I was asked by the school administrator, which is the monthly publication of the Superintendents Association across the country, to be one of about a dozen prognosticators, if you will, on what public education will look like in 2025. I took as my contribution to that the market share approach. In 1999, public ed had about a 91% market share of the pie of all. There are about 57 million school-age children in the country. Right now, public education holds a little less than around 50 million, maybe slightly less when the numbers come in. Maybe we're saying 49.5 million or something. It would be my ballpark on that when the numbers come in around the country. Private schools have about a 10% market share and have had a fairly steady market share for many years. They enroll pretty consistently between 5 and 6 million children a year. It's that group of homeschoolers and then the charter schoolers that have grown. Charter schools have grown a lot, but as I said earlier, 3.5 million kids maybe in charters, and maybe somewhere between 3.5 and 5 million kids in homeschooling right now. Right now, I'm thinking that in 2021, when you take out the charters, we're looking at the charter school kids, we're looking at about an 80% market rate. So is my prognostication correct? Maybe. We're tracking that way. I'm looking at public education right now having an 81.5% market share in the traditional public schools. Well, is it going to lose another 8.5% of kids by 2025 to reach what I predicted in 1999 would be a 70% market share? I think it will. I think the pressures on it from COVID, from the social disruptions, from the rise of technology are unbelievable. I believe even the election on Tuesday of Youngkin in Virginia was really spurred by all analysis by a revolt on parents on education. And the Youngkin won that race with little question based upon McAuliffe's mismanagement or fumbling on some public education issues. So I think that's going to be, it's only one election, but it's a trend that will really be picked up in the midterm elections coming up. And I think we're heading toward a decrease in public education market share. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate you listening to me drone on. I will change this and introduce Chelsea.
I was not droning by any means. That was really fascinating, John and Mark before you. I have the privilege of getting to go last, which I love because I get to see sort of the ways that each of your comments builds on each other and sometimes challenges each other, and the ways that hopefully mine coming up will fit in. So let me just hold on one second to John. I'm not, I don't know if you transferred the host privileges to me. I can't see the screen sharing function yet.
I have changed presenters to Chelsea. There you are. Perhaps I missed the second button. My apologies, Chelsea. I think that should be coming your way.
I am not seeing it yet. I don't know, did that go through? Oh, there we go. Here we go. Got it.
My apologies. I'm sure it was my.
Not at all. All right. It's great to be here with you all. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm on the West Coast in Seattle, Washington, so it's still morning for me. My name is Chelsea Waite. I'm a senior researcher at the Center on Reinventing Public Education. We are a nonpartisan research center based at the University of Washington, Bothell, with about a 30-year history of studying some of these essential questions about public education and the way that it has changed. It has, and the ways that it's not changed and the ways that it might need to change. So really happy to have joined the center, which we call CERPI, just in the last month or so, and excited to present some thoughts here on what might be possible if we really unleash innovation in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. I want to start here with a quote that really struck me. It's sort of a combination quote from Greg Baer, who is the co-chair of the Remake Learning Network in Pittsburgh, as well as our beloved Fred Rogers, which hopefully, many people have a soft spot in your heart for Fred Rogers. But Fred Rogers said, often when you think you're at the end of something, you're at the beginning of something else. And then Greg adds on to that the something else is up to us now. And I think this resonates because in some ways we find ourselves, wanting to be at the end of the pandemic. And at the same time, there's an option ahead about, are we going sort of fully back to normal in K-12 education, or are we starting to build something else out of this moment where the ground really shifted underneath schools? So I want to start sort of with some premises here. The first is that public education is absolutely essential to our country's democracy and progress. And so, with all that you've heard so far from Mark about some changing enrollment numbers, from John about, the possible future broadening of educational options and choices, our strong belief at CERPI is that those options and choices still need to be systematized in a way that really preserves public accountability in education and educational options for every single student that provide them high quality learning opportunities. So that's sort of the first premise. The second one, however, is that despite the fact that our public schools have indeed changed and adapted in many ways over the decades, they're still sort of held back by a conventional system that was originally designed to rank and sort students and not to support every single learner to fulfill their unique potential. And we know so much more now from the learning science about the vast sort of diversity in how students learn and the variability in learning that was always present and in many ways is growing. So we've really got to think about school systems that are more responsive to students' individual strengths, preferences, and needs. And so, my core premise is that back to normal actually isn't a goal that we should aspire to necessarily. And so what would that something else, going back to Fred Rogers' quote, look like? So when Peter introduced me, he mentioned that one of the projects that I lead is called the Canopy Project, which is a national data building project, kind of a crowdsourcing project to document innovation in schools around the country, schools and sort of out of system learning environments more broadly. Currently, the project documents 232 schools and sort of various replacements to school. And these schools are in suburban, urban, and rural communities. We have current data on schools in 43 states across the country, and schools in 49 states plus DC have been nominated for the project. And what the project does is documents basically what are the practices that these schools are implementing on the ground in order to change students' learning experiences in ways that create really equitable and extraordinary learning environments. These are traditional public district schools. There are charter schools. The majority are actually public district schools, traditional district schools. There are charter schools, and there are a handful of independent schools in the data as well. So, in my part of this presentation, before we get to our discussion, I wanted to sort of paint a little bit of a picture of how we already see a number of schools around the country really challenging assumptions about what school is and should be. So I'll give some examples here. This is the way that the project works is schools sort of tag themselves. They use a set of keywords and phrases to indicate the practices that they're implementing. So on the screen, what you're seeing is a number of the practices that are most commonly indicated by schools as really core and central to what they do. So you can see, for example, that social emotional learning and project-based learning in these innovative schools that have been nominated for the ways that they're thinking outside of the box are some of the most common core approaches, and they've also been implemented by many schools for quite a long time. You know, over half in each case say that they've been implementing those practices for over 5 years. The green parts of this chart show where schools are adopting new practices. So as of 2020 and 21, there were a number of schools who were reporting that social emotional learning was a new practice for them, implemented less than a year. Blended learning, which is the integration of online learning in a face-to-face learning environment, it was one of the most often newly adopted practices in the 2020-21 school year, which is, you know, no surprise given the massive growth of online learning. So that's just a hint at how the data is structured. But today, sort of rather than focusing on the numbers, I actually just want to give some examples about how these schools are challenging core assumptions about what we consider as school. And I'm hoping that these concrete examples of what schools are doing on the ground will help to sort of push perhaps some of our assumptions in this conversation about how planners can best support public districts as they think about what might come next, what a new normal might look like. So that the first assumption is that learning must happen inside school walls. And there are a number of schools in the data that we see really challenging this. For instance, the Grand Rapids Public Museum High School in Michigan, the Science and Math Institute in Tacoma, Washington, and the Verde Eco School in Melbourne, Florida, are all anchoring students' learning experiences inside of local institutions like museums, as in the case of the Public Museum High School, and in zoos, which is the case with the Science and Math Institute and the Eco School. So, you know, we really see these as the vanguards of much more flexible systems that are blending schools with community institutions to create rich learning opportunities for students. Some other examples from the data include a number of high schools in the Big Picture Learning Network, where students in those high schools pursue internships based on the interests that they want to explore. So every single student has an internship every year. And these internships aren't extras to a student's core school experience. They're actually a central part of that experience, and they contribute to graduation requirements. So students actually earn credit toward graduation through doing these internships. Those examples are longer standing, so they predate the pandemic, but we also see some evidence that schools are beginning to experiment with more sort of porousness between the school building and the community, such as North Edgecombe High School in North Carolina, where the school is partnering with community-based organizations to engage kids in interest-driven projects during the core school day, so as part of their core educational experience. The second assumption that these schools are challenging is that virtual learning is inherently inferior. And this has been a thread throughout our conversation today so far. Unfortunately, the pandemic really strengthened the notion that online learning, remote learning, virtual learning is inherently inferior. And unfortunately, in many cases, as the other presenters have shared, that is true, especially for districts where they simply weren't prepared. They had never done this before and were not prepared to transition to a fully virtual learning environment that's really high quality. But the Canopy data shows a number of schools, such as the Washtenaw Alliance for Virtual Education in Michigan, where students across the county can enroll as an alternative to their home districts in this virtual learning program. And so what is that virtual learning program? It is not simply sort of staring at your screen for 6 hours a day watching lectures on video. It's actually an interdisciplinary, project-based, sort of enriched virtual approach where students can join in person for meetings and workshops a couple days a week. And so that's allowing them to, the core of their learning is online, but it allows them to build relationships and get support while also experiencing greater flexibility and autonomy in their school experiences. And so, you know, I fully concede the ways that that virtual learning programs are, you know, demonstrably not meeting expectations in many cases. But I think we really need to look at examples of programs that are sort of challenging this short-sighted conviction that just because we sort of know more about how to do in-person learning best, that it's actually best for most students, and it should be mandated for all students. We've definitely seen that through the pandemic, some students and families actually do prefer a more flexible experience that is in part or even in whole virtual. So the third assumption that these schools are challenging is that equity just means closing the achievement gap. So, you know, equity is not a new concept by any means in the education system. It's been the goal of education reformers for many, many years now, this notion that we know that we have inequities that often and mostly fall along the lines of socioeconomics. And so the goal has been to close sort of this achievement gap and make sure that students are achieving at the same levels. However, half of the school leaders in the Canopy surveys shared that one of their school's reasons for innovating is not just to close the achievement gap, but to really counteract inequities that are hardwired into our systems. So I'll give two examples here. One is Rooted School, which is in 4 communities around the country and aims, one of the goals of their school is to close the racial wealth gap, especially for Black students, and work to ensure that students are graduating with a college acceptance in one hand and a job offer with growth potential in the other hand. So that's one example of where this is not just about you know, equal achievement. This is about putting students on a path that works for them, in which they are going to thrive in ways that are culturally relevant to them. And a couple other examples are from a set of laboratory public charter schools in Hawaii that were founded by Native Hawaiian families and that are Hawaiian immersion schools. So they immerse students in the Hawaiian language as part of their mission to create a culturally responsive learning environment for those students. The fourth assumption that these schools are challenging is that academic learning can be separated from supporting the whole child. You heard Mark talk about many of the social, emotional, and sort of mental health concerns among students, especially coming out of the pandemic. And we see that among schools in the Canopy, 71% are reporting integrating social and emotional learning throughout the academic curriculum. So this is not an add-on, it's actually part of how they do school. So some examples there, at Ember Charter School for Mindful Education, Innovation, and Transformation, quite an amazing school name. Educators are teaching mindfulness practices and using trauma-informed techniques to nurture students' critical thinking, and sort of disrupt the traditional narrative about rigor and high expectations as the only ways to drive academic learning, that we actually need to recognize the context that students are in and support them as whole humans. And at Shawnee High School, which is in rural Oklahoma, the high school has worked with community partners to provide telehealth services for students who lack access and would otherwise have to miss school for a medical appointment of some kind. So these and many other schools in the data are embracing this research that learning depends on critical building blocks of wellness and social emotional development, and we have to attend to those in addition to the academic concerns. Last year, and I'm going to wrap up this one quickly because I want to get to our questions. But last is this assumption that certified teachers are the only adults who can help students succeed in school. And so there are a range of examples in the data where schools are using really creative staffing models to help teachers really specialize in the work that they do best, which is supporting students academically and building strong relationships with students. And they're bringing in a range of other adults who are also supporting students in different ways. So there's a network of charter schools called Great Oaks that uses recent college graduates as tutors, and they do so through an AmeriCorps volunteer program. Those big picture learning schools that I mentioned at the in the assumption number 1, those schools bring the internship hosts in as mentors for high school students and really critical sort of members of their support networks. And one last example here in Central Falls, Rhode Island, they actually sort of initiated during the pandemic and are now expanding a program that brings community members into schools to support students who have been really disengaged in school. And those community members notably are far more representative of the student population in the district. And so that part of their goal is to create a stronger pipeline for those community members into public education in some form. Maybe it's not necessarily as a teacher, but as a bus driver, as a paraprofessional, as a counselor. So as we sort of think about these examples of, schools are already kind of challenging some of our assumptions about what we know will work to get us from sort of point A, where we are now, to point B, which is a much more equitable and student-centered system that supports every student's potential and supports them to achieve that potential. And so I think, to close out here, what I'm excited about this conversation with a national group of professional planners, because you all are engaged in like, what are the most effective ways of planning when we actually we don't necessarily have sort of proven pathways from point A to point B. So a lot of the conversations that I've been having with school leaders and system leaders recently is about how we cannot sort of public education cannot sort of embrace only this traditional form of planning in which we just say, based on everything that we know, we think that our methods of getting to point A to point B are going to work. And so we're just going to create a 5-year plan and then implement. And we kind of get part of the way there, run into a roadblock, and then suddenly the entire effort is derailed. What we've been talking about instead is a much more iterative form of planning, where there are these built-in points of learning and kind of redirection, so that the planning process becomes much more flexible, and we actually, maybe the pathway from point A to point B takes some turns, but it has these built-in points for learning and redirection. So I'm excited about the conversation that we're having today, because I think you all likely think about this at a much deeper level, and can potentially partner with our public schools in order to think about what is that point B that they're trying to get to, and how can we kind of build on what we know, but also test some of our assumptions, and perhaps challenge some of our assumptions in ways that get us to a much more student-centered and equitable system. One of my favorite quotes from the founder of the organization where I now work, SERPI, is that public education is a goal, not a particular set of institutions. And so I think as we move forward into the something else that comes after the pandemic, it's critical to be really rethinking and reimagining what are the sets of institutions and the systems that we build that can get us to that goal of public education that creates opportunities for every single student. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and we can get to questions, which I'm really excited about.
Well, thank you, Mark, Chelsea, and John. There were some questions, and I had to put them in a Word document. It's hard to read them, but one of them was, is this presentation available? I know they're recording it, and I presume also the PDFs of the slides will be available and posted on the Ohio APA site as well. So you'll be able to get that information, the slides. So we have a few questions. There are a lot of words in them, so I'll try and ask them slow, but the first one is, has COVID-19 had any impact? And I think John, I don't know if John mentioned this about the impact on the shared use of school facilities for community recreation or community events. And if schools become check-in stations rather than the holding tanks, John, that you used, or a daily destination for learning, what impact will that have on those recreational facilities at school sites? And what impact will that have on community rec facilities and meeting facilities if there are shared use agreements, as some communities rely on these facilities for recreation and other meeting facilities? So anybody want, I know John, you might want to answer. I don't know if Mark has any, would want to answer this as well. So basically, if we're going from holding tanks to check-in stations, and maybe there's some agreements in communities to use of those facilities for meetings, recreation. I don't know if it'll get to the point where, we'll not have any schools, but I'll let the panelists try and address that question.
Well, Mark, Peter, I'll say this quickly, and I think Mark may have a more studied approach to it. I don't know the answer. I have not considered that. I understand the question, but I've not seen the shared use agreements with community education and other community services are common. I imagine that my thought would they would be honored if schools become more of check-in stations, and the other community service components of public schools, or whether they have a open door or a closed door policy as school boards have to select, will continue without interruption. That is my guess. But I will actually, Mark, I'm sure that you're closer to that question than I am.
Yeah, well, what I would add to that is, especially in a lot of our rural communities, school districts are often one of the hubs of the community for civic groups, for young athletic groups, youth groups of all types. And so therefore those facilities can get used pretty hard in the evenings. I know the school district where I was superintendent, it was pretty common that those buildings were being used sometimes 7 days a week. So, consequently, I think that need is going to be there, and many communities have just, come to believe that those facilities are always going to be there. So if we start to move away from the traditional model that we have, there's going to have to be other facilities that are going to have the venues that can take a school district's place. So that would be another transition that would have to occur over time in school districts or in communities if that starts to happen, if that trend starts to go into place.
Okay.
The only thing I would add on to that, just briefly, is that, I think this community, you all as urban planners, community planners, are in a unique position where you can likely help different leaders of institutions, including in public education and others like museums, libraries, really think about how use is spread out across all of those institutions. And if they are becoming a little bit more porous, I think Mark's example of the ways that school buildings are used 7 days a week in some rural communities, we could be seeing that far more throughout the country in all communities. And the same goes for museums, libraries. So there are few people, to my knowledge, other than this group of folks on the call, who are really thinking about use of our facilities in those broader terms.
Great. Okay, another question had to do kind of with the social aspect of education, specifically remote learning. It said somebody asked, remote learning may be cheaper, but is it really better for the social development of children? Instead of one or the other, could you speak of how hybrid models might be deployed?
I think hybrid model is the future. I don't mean to imply in my view of this that children will stay home 24/7, 7 days a week, and go to school by remotely at all. And that's why I say that schools will become, I use the expression check-in stations, but I think Chelsea gave some great examples of schools that are actually functioning and doing quite well for children, where children are not there 35 hours a week. Maybe they're there twice a week for social reasons, for the things that you can't do effectively, for participation in plays, for participation in sport, for drama and dance and the humanities. It's wonderful to be in place, and also for discussion of lessons around history or mathematics. I see schools as being places where children might not go every day. They may only go 2 days a week. And again, that can reduce transportation, that can reduce building expenses. We don't have to add on because we don't have to expand. But by no means do I think that children are not going to have the social opportunities. The other thing that I will say is that oftentimes homeschoolers are thought to be kind of social isolationists. And in my study and in my observation of homeschoolers, I find them to be incredibly social with tremendous social networks and tremendous community development within their homeschool community. So I don't imply and I don't want to see children isolated by technology, but think that the social involvement is incredibly important for the development. I ask my colleagues to comment as well.
Well, related to that, John, somebody said, what value does each of you place on the role of human interaction in education? Kind of related to that previous question about the social.
Well,
you alluded to that. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing there is I think the research is pretty replete in stating that learning is a social activity, and that as humans we are wired to learn socially. So consequently, whether it's in a traditional school setting where, like John said, the kids are there 7 hours a day, or it's some other type of social gathering, whether it's a pod or something like that, those are the types of learning activities and environments that are really important to allow children to grow and learn, and even adults to learn. So consequently, some type of social aspect is going to have to be in place. You're just not going to be able to have kids sitting in front of a laptop all day at their kitchen table. That is not going to work.
Yep, fully agree. I actually think we should be in part judging the quality of any virtual or blended learning program on the extent to which it succeeds at building really strong relationships among students and their peers, and among students and adults in their learning environments.
I read an essay, Peter, this morning, and friends, that was written in 1996, and it was about how technology was kind of taking over. Remember, this is 96, before social media, even before really great use of websites and business. And what it said, and it drove me to this point that someone just asked, it said that basically technology is going to kind of neutralize itself eventually to what will rise is humanity and the ability of people to communicate again and to tell stories and to do art. And I think we're at a turning point right now that the engagement, I was introduced as the chairman of Galileo Education. That's what I do. And it is a future of schooling, in my view, that puts humanity, wraps technology in humanity. And that is something I hope that we all will do, public schools, private schools, communities, and businesses. And that will be a great opportunity for us not to become dependent upon artificial intelligence and kind of a dystopian future that's so common in movies and television these days.
And Peter, if I could just add something very quickly to this discussion that I think is an issue that needs to be addressed, is if we do move to more alternative forms of schooling, whether it's hybrid or some other pod learning, so forth, one of the things that became very evident during the pandemic was how much many of our parents who were in the workforce relied on the custodial aspect of schooling for their children. So they knew that, I can drop my kid off at the school at 8 in the morning and my child's not coming home till 3 in the afternoon. And I can go to work during those hours. I only have to worry about, covering maybe an hour or two at the beginning of the day or the end of the day till I get home. And so whatever new model of education starts to develop over time, that custodial aspect is still going to be very critical for many parents in the workforce, especially if both parents are working or it's just a single parent home.
Well, that was a question, and you just, somebody asked, what about parents that have to work? Well, we don't, if the kids are home and they have to work and they don't want to leave them, don't have latchkey kids at home, what will be done for parents who both need to work? So you kind of raised that or answered that. So I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts on that with regard to parents that have to work and, you know, have the kids in school, so they're occupied and learning, and they're able to go to work. Now, I don't know, and then they said this raises questions of equity, so I don't know if that's been discussed or any thoughts on that. Obviously, you know, if both parents have to work, then they have to work maybe to provide for the family.
I certainly agree, Peter, that it raises questions of equity. That's a great misfortune in our society and the economic structure. I often think when asked that question, Mark made an example in his early presentation that sometimes parents found during the pandemic that they liked having their kids home, and maybe having them home is a blessing for that family. So they may be staying home Tuesday, Thursday, works for that family. I also think that, Peter, and an audience, that I believe that if school evolves like this, the markets respond to need, and there'll be things that evolve that we don't see yet that support families who need to work and their child needs care in some regard. And I believe that may be an evolving role again for public education. There is a huge custodial responsibility or reality for schools in America, for public schools, 50 million children. But I think that we're not going to turn into a society of latchkey kids. There will be responses. I don't know what they are. I just have faith that there will be responses.
And I think we have indications of responses to that. I think the one, key distinction that I would draw is that the pandemic era remote learning, in which online learning happened at home, is actually not necessarily the case in a lot of the really interesting hybrid and virtual options that we're seeing, where, as I mentioned, enriched virtual I think is more the norm even than virtual, where students actually do have places to go. They have spaces in which they're interacting with peers and with adults that support their learning, but the backbone of their learning is happening online in ways that actually free up teachers to do some of the work that they really love to do, which is support students in smaller groups, in smaller group instruction, and build relationships and trust with their students.
Okay. There's a question on deferred maintenance. I know we talked a little bit about each one. Some of you talked about that. And deferred maintenance in existing schools is a massive problem. With more options pulling funding away from existing infrastructure, these problems seem to be exacerbated. While those who cannot enroll in a charter school, many of which have new facilities, be relegated to poorer facilities. How can we invest in needed maintenance with so much competition for scarce resources? And I know, Mark, you mentioned those one-time funds, and some of that might be used for that, but I guess long-term, that's the question.
Yeah,
maybe even short-term.
Well, I can just tell you in Pennsylvania, the conversation that's been going on with our policymakers is who's responsible for the funding of those facilities and that infrastructure. Is it the state's responsibility? Is it a joint effort between the state and the local community? And there are stark disagreements about that. And consequently, what happens is if the state doesn't provide adequate funding for school construction and renovation, the local community has to do it. And sometimes some of those communities are very capable, like you see in our wealthy, advantaged suburbs, and some of them are incapable. And that's when you see the crumbling buildings in our urban centers and our rural districts. So that drives more inequity through the system. So that conversation is ongoing. It's been going on for a while, and I'm not sure what the resolution to it is. But if we are going to have safe, healthy environments for kids to learn, whether it's a current configuration or something new down the road, we have to make a decision as to who's going to fund it, who's going to pay for it.
Okay, anybody else? Now we'll go to we have a few more questions. Prior to the pandemic, there was much discussion in the planning field about school choice, including charters, vouchers. We heard about that today, eroding the idea that a school serves as a community hub in neighborhoods. There's a lot of data and analysis showing how school choice increases gaps in racial and social equity and thus student achievement. With the trends that John discussed in the future of schools post-pandemic, is it realistic for the planning field to hold on to the idea that schools are the center of neighborhood and community life? And if the planning field should continue to value schools as a center to neighborhood life, what can we do to support this?
It's a great question, Peter. I appreciate the thoughtfulness of the questioner putting that together. I believe, again, society will evolve in a way, and if you're asking a question, should a planner continue to think of schools as a central place? Yes, I believe so, but I think you should be ready for an evolution of that. I just do, for the reasons that I present, and I crystal ball or I research about technology, about parental choice, about declining populations. I think that the school's role will evolve. It will cease. I think more functions might become community-based. For instance, sport. Sport is a very vital part of school identity, community identity throughout the country. And schools hold sport, high school sport, inside of their walls. That may be evolving in like other nations to a more of a community function. And so the schools focus on learning, and communities be able to sponsor football teams and volleyball and girls softball, all of the events that are so important to community building and to development of adolescence. But that's an evolution that I think could happen because with the social changes that we're seeing and the incredible amount of pressure financially on the country. When I became a professor in the early 80s, we spent half of every dollar across the country on education at the state level. Today, it's not nearly that robust. We have far, far, far more things competing for that public purse. And public education is getting pushed down the food chain, if you will. And that's going to have consequences. The planner's job, I think, is just to keep up with that, stay in touch with the school district, stay in touch with the legislative processes, and respond the best they can to making communities that are good for as many, for all people if possible. My thoughts. Mark, I know you've got, I saw your head shaking. I know you've got thoughts.
Yeah, I'll add just a couple of things here from our perspective on our organization. And first of all, we are not opposed to choice. However, we are opposed to this idea that public dollars that should be allocated for the public education of all children in that community should not be going to private entities or being funneled in the hands of parents to send their kids to a private school entity. We believe that does more harm overall than good. And somewhere along the line, we've had this clash of philosophy take place that is very paramount across the nation now. And at one point in time, our public schools were designed around the issue of equity, that the community and the state were going to come together, pool their resources, and make sure that every child within that community was able to get an education at their local public school. Today, the choice philosophy is, well, let's take a look at all the kids in that community. Let's put a dollar figure for every student out there. And then let's let those parents make a decision as to where they want to send their kids to school. And what's more important is that parent and that choice of where they want to send their kids to school, then what's good for the entire community and all the kids in the community. And those two forces are at work right now, and they're at loggerheads with each other. And I think that debate, it continues to rage, and more states are trying to find ways to funnel public dollars into private education, and it creates more inequity in the services to students. So once again, we're not against choice. If a parent wants to homeschool their kid, that's great. If they want to send their kid to a parochial school because of the religious component, that's great. But that's not part of the public's responsibility. And our responsibility as a collective whole is to make sure all kids have that opportunity for an adequate education. And the public needs to pool their resources together to do it. We shouldn't have fixed a set figure per student and say, that's your money, go spend it the way you want to.
Okay, I think probably have one more question, if maybe two, but we'll see how the first one goes. Educators in public schools provide services beyond traditional instructions. Teachers see and help address social, emotional, other special needs. Many public services were not available to students with needs last year during the pandemic. Now, particularly in early childhood, we're seeing more students with unaddressed needs that have only been amplified. How can we reconnect public services to needs and safeguard against future scenarios of potentially less frequent director-educator presence? So I know it was addressed by some of you that, possibly they're, not having kids in school and some of these things went unaddressed. So I don't know if there's any thoughts.
Yeah, my quick thought on that is I think all of us, not just public education, but almost every social entity out there that serves the public, we need to be better prepared for the next pandemic or the next thing that could come in and totally shut down our normal operations and protocols and the normal standard of living that we have, because we were all caught short on this. And, we fumbled our way through it. And I hope at least we're coming out of it now, but we have to be better prepared the next time around, because, we've really seen a lot of harm caused to a generation of kids over the last year and a half.
My only parallel, please go ahead, Chelsea.
The only thing I was going to add on to that is the way that I think the comment reflects a really critical concern, and we have a tendency to kind of pile expectations on schools that especially land on teachers, where now teachers not only have to teach academic content, they're also expected to be sort of supporting all of students' social and emotional needs. And in many ways they want to, right? Like this is not to say that teachers should not be doing that, but it is to say that we need to be thinking about leveraging more community assets throughout a community, so that schools are not having to bear the burden, not just of educating students, but of remedying all of these various societal challenges that we have facing us before the pandemic and especially now.
Yeah, so you're saying, use other social organizations in the community to assist in that, and work with other entities to help address
and
those issues.
We saw some of that. We saw some innovative approaches to that with community and public district supported sort of learning hubs when students had to be learning at home. They couldn't come into the school building, but there were these other kind of organic support structures that popped up. Many of those are now fading because the needs have changed, but I think it demonstrates the way that schools and other community support organizations can be working in closer concert.
Okay, and we talked about the hybrid model. Somebody said, you expect less need for physical space. They said in an urban environment, it would seem that you could potentially divest from some spaces with years of deferred maintenance and create hubs for students on different schedules to share. They don't know if that's going to work for rural environments, and I'm not sure how that works for parents either, though. So I don't know if there's any thoughts on that question.
Totally agree that it's contextual to the community, and also really excited to see what you all, planners across the country come up with as you think about getting creative with uses of space, especially in urban environments where, I'm near downtown Seattle, where the downtown area is pretty empty. So how can we be using that in different ways?
Well, I thank Mark, John, and Chelsea. Somebody did put in the chat or question. This is a fascinating topic, and they really appreciate the expertise each of one of you brings to today's presentation. So thank you.
You're welcome.
So at this point, I'm going to turn it back to Christine for any parting words.
Thank you. This is really great. I love this conversation, and thank you, Peter, for taking over and working on that on the Q&A portion. That was really great. I know there were questions about the recording and the slide decks. Yes to both. We have them both. They will be up. You can get links to everything on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. That's where we'll post the slide deck and a link to our YouTube channel as well. So thanks to everyone. Thank you, APA Pennsylvania, and to all of our speakers today and everyone on the line. We appreciate you attending today, and everyone have a great weekend. We'll talk next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John, Mark,
Thank
Peter.
you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.